Now we're going to do something slightly unusual for the Entrepreneurs Forum, and hear from some clients on the future of work. This is particularly interesting to me because I once sat through a presentation in which the founder of an agency spent an hour or so explaining how employees came first, and the agency really cared about the employee life experience, and then welcomed one of the agency's clients who immediately started ranting about if there was ever a time when he couldn't reach the account lead on his business at 2 o'clock in the morning, the agency would be fired immediately. My point not being that our clients who are about to appear are cut from the same cloth, but that the work experience in agencies is very much defined by the expectations of the agency's client. And hopefully we'll capture some of that, as well as what's going on in the corporate world as we look at the future of work and the imperative of building a strong and inclusive culture. And here to lead that discussion is APCO Worldwide Managing Director, Lysi DeCanto.
Go ahead and unmute, Lysi, you're still muted.
My apologies. Good morning, everyone. I'm excited to be with you. As Paul said, I'm Lysi DeCanto. I'm the Managing Director for APCO Worldwide's Washington, D.C. office and global headquarters. And we're here to talk about the future of work and building a strong and inclusive culture. I cannot think of a more important topic for our time than what we're talking about here today. When I think about the topic, I think about the recent IPO last week from WeWork, the community office space organization. Its chairman recently said that, quote, one size fits all is dead. And he's talking there about the 9-to-5 work week. At the same time, we had recently CEO for JP Morgan Chase, Jamie Dimon, talk about the importance of working in an office environment, and saying that, quote, remote work virtually eliminates spontaneous learning and creativity because you don't run into people at the office or the coffee machine, and it's hard to engage in work. He has since changed that narrative, but importantly, you can see these are two sides of the debate in terms of how to go back to the workplace in the midst of us hopefully coming out of the pandemic. And so how do we reconcile these transitions to the quote unquote next normal? What are the lessons that we are going to learn in building a strong, inclusive culture in a remote environment? And how do organizations best prepare for that future work? These are some of the questions that we're going to get into today with our extraordinary panel. I'm very excited to welcome them for the conversation. Catherine Beiser is Vice President of Global Communication for Eli Lilly, where she leads and oversees leadership management and oversight for communication strategy and policy and performance and communication activities across the organization. She has a long and distinguished career, and I want to thank Kathy for joining us today. Joining us also is Duncan Cox. He is the Vice President of Business Development at the Learning Economy Foundation, which is a US-based nonprofit organization with a global mission to accelerate the world toward a 21st century education and workplace infrastructure, addressing equity with students and employee-centric models, and connecting fragmenting ecosystems of stakeholders into a unified hub of innovation. Thank you for joining us, Duncan. And Eric Cross, he is the former Senior Vice President, Chief Communications and Corporate Affairs Officers for Bacardi Limited. He was previously the Senior Vice President for Corporate Communications and Public Affairs at Covidien. He also, prior to that, was the Vice President External Relations for Gillette, Procter & Gamble Company, a position he assumed following the merger of Procter & Gamble and Gillette Company, where he served as the Vice President of Corporate Communication. Welcome to you all. Thank you very much. I want to dive in and start with you, Kathy. When we think about the last almost 2 years and the challenges that we faced for those of us in the workplace, if you will, in the office space, we have faced so much. I want to start with you. Lily has been at the forefront of working on and promoting diverse, inclusive culture. I think about what your CEO, Dave Rick, said last year, where he was talking about making sustainable impact, and he talked about building an inclusive culture. He said, to fulfill our purpose, we need the best people to solve the world's toughest health challenges. We work every day to build a diverse, equitable, and inclusive culture where everyone is valued and heard. Tell us a little bit about what are the biggest lessons that you and Lily have learned from transitioning from the office to remote to a hybrid situation.
Wow, there's a lot to unpack in that question because there's so many dimensions to it. So I'm hoping Eric or Duncan can also jump in on this too, because there's so, listen, I think we start and end with the idea of inclusivity, right, for everybody. And I think in some respects, we even look at being inclusive first before, because that will help really guarantee the diversity. And then which leads to equity. So I think we're looking at that and making sure we create a very inclusive culture. So that's where we start. Lessons learned, oh my God, there's so many of them. But I think one of the things that we realized, and we were a very traditional company in some respects, we didn't have a lot of remote workers outside of our sales force. They were the exception rather than the rule. So we learned pretty quickly that we could transition on a dime and actually do well. And do very, very well. I mean, one of the things that Lily did, we talk about this, is that our scientists ran into the fire, if you will, because we were working on treatments for COVID. So not only did we have all of the things that you would deal with from a company perspective during a pandemic, we were also trying to solve it. So it was very, very intense. So a couple things that we really did learn. One, well, first of all, we're resilient. Second of all, we have been, I think, we have been living off of our cultural capital, if you will, for the last 18 months, 19 months, which has served us well. We're a 145-year-old company. But as we look to the next stage of what it means to work hybrid, how do we continue to build that capital has been one of the sort of lessons, that you can't continue to take from that bank and expect it to always be there, especially if you're new. I started during the pandemic. I hadn't met most of my team until I think about almost a year ago. So that was really, I still haven't met everybody in person. So I think that's a big piece of it. But we also learned there were big gaps. Our young people, we felt like they were isolated. They haven't had the mentoring and the growth that they need to have. I think we also learned that whereas we did really well on some of our values and moving things forward, acting with integrity, all of that, we weren't as inclusive as we could have been because we were so focused. So now as we pivot, the idea is to how do we bring in the inclusivity, which is so important to us, to our operating model going forward, no matter if it's in office, hybrid, or fully remote.
Thank you, Kathy. I too started during the pandemic, and I think I've met everyone by now, but certainly a challenging and interesting time. And I want to turn to you, Duncan, at the Learning Economy Foundation. And at the heart of your foundation is addressing equity and building inclusivity in the ways that you do it. And what are some of the lessons that you've learned, and how have you built resiliency into the table at which your employees sit?
Sure. Yeah, so learning economy is kind of the opposite situation. We've been remote since day one. And so when the pandemic started, we actually had a bit of a leg up on our clients and our partners. So, as they entered that shift to hybrid and remote workspaces, we were able to sort of shepherd and steward our community into that space. One thing we have noticed, and some studies have gone out to corroborate this. Granted, it's fairly new information, so I'm sure newer stuff will come out 10 years from now. But remote work can have a really outsized negative impact on both younger employees and women employees, specifically in respects to Zoom fatigue. When you're on a camera, when you're constantly looking at a weird kind of low resolution mirrored image of yourself, especially when you're an employee who has something to prove, you're not as established, and you're kind of held to different standards about how you present yourself, it can make it a lot more stressful to be on Zoom calls all day. And so at Learning Economy, one of the things we've learned is a great way to include everybody, a great way to increase access and also just effectiveness of meetings is cameras off by default. Whether someone is on a walk trying to get some fresh air and exercise, whether they're out of their home office taking care of a sick family member, or maybe they just didn't feel like washing their hair or shaving today, right? These are things that we like to build into this kind of small inclusive company space. When you have your camera off, anyone can join at the table in the space that they're at. And that opens the door for a lot of people to participate in ways that they otherwise might not have with cameras on, or even in an in-person workspace. And so that's something that I think, it's a really quick, easy solution to make sure that, your younger employees and the women on your team feel more included into the conversation.
Duncan, thank you. Eric, you've held many positions across the private sector. What are some of the lessons that you're seeing? And let's dig into what both Kathy and Duncan talked about, the importance of focusing in particular during this time on our mid and younger staff, and how do we ensure that they, together with others, are felt are included in the work that's being done. Eric?
Thanks, Lucy. I'm probably the dinosaur here, and and colleagues in probably my generation are as uncomfortable with remote as some of the negatives you've been hearing, both from my co-panelists. But I'm a big believer in face-to-face. I'm a big believer in office environment and the teamwork that comes out of that. So I think companies in general just have to work that much harder to try to duplicate the benefits of that. And I think as we go forward, there's going to always be the ROI analysis. Do we stay remote? Do we stay a hybrid model? Or do we go back full to the office? And what does that do as far as the ROI on not having office space and the pros and the cons? But at the end of the day, there's never been more of a need for a company to have a purpose and to drive home its values. And companies have to work that much harder now because their workforce is remote. But I've seen some great examples of mocktail parties, of events, of trying to duplicate some of the fun things that companies would do face-to-face, where packages are arriving at employees' homes and people are opening them up on camera. There has to be a way to bring what a company stands for to life outside of the company, and companies really have to focus on that. To what has been said so far, I think without that, the isolation and the feeling of not being part of a team and not being able to, say, roll up your sleeves as easy and distinguish yourself from your coworkers just becomes that much harder.
Kathy Beiser, there is a great section on your website that focuses on employee experiences and talks about the work that they're doing. And Eric and you and Duncan have raised a number of critical questions in terms of how do you ensure that we strike a balance between purpose and also making sure that our employees feel engaged and not on an island. Tell us a little bit about how you look at this question of Zoom on, Zoom off. When we think about management, we think about flexibility and we think about engagement. How do you do that when we're in a hybrid environment where we go beyond meetings to real employee engagement? And how do you think that is tied to the purpose, particularly there for Lilly?
Everything we do starts and ends with purpose. I mean, I think for some companies, might be a little bit more challenging, but when you're in the business of creating medicines that save lives, we sort of have a leg up on purpose. People feel pretty dedicated to that. So we come in the office, we know who we do it for every day. One of the things that we've been really focused on is ensuring that we talk about purpose a lot. And we give just living examples of it, about how we're doing. And these examples are the day-to-day. We're trying to figure out how we don't always focus on the heroic, the people that spent all of this time or gave up all of this, their lives and things like that to focus on X, but how we all contribute to that purpose, that everybody's role is important in that. So I think that helps sort of level set, because if you're talking about being inclusive, you really are about showing how everybody's role is important to getting everything across the finish line and delivering on our purpose. And I think as storytellers, sometimes we have this tendency to want that amazing story, right? That is just, oh my God, I can't believe they did that. Oh, and they had COVID at the same time. I mean, the whole thing, you keep looking for those pieces. And I think if you flip that, and it becomes more about finding the divine in the ordinary, I guess, and finding those things that really, you draw that out. It's a harder process, but I think it really strikes a chord with people when you can talk about, the pieces and how they work together. And we've also focused on the teamwork examples. I think that very much helps too, from creating that inclusive, and you're not here on an island. We do celebrate teams a lot. We call ourselves Team Lily. So, and there's an aspect of what we do, that's a Team Lily behavior. These are Team Lily, ways of operating. So I think that helps. But for us, I think, this is a complex operating environment right now, and we're all navigating. I've talked to other heads of comms, and we're all sort of going, whoa, this is very, very different, because we thought we were headed here, and then Delta hit. We were in the office, for example, starting July 12th, and then Delta hit, which through all of our, best laid plans, we plan and then the universe laughs. And it just threw everything up, and we had to shift. And right now we're in the process of redefining what this looks like for us going forward, and really communicating expectations for folks. So, because I think there's so much uncertainty, that's very tiring for people. People want flexibility, but they also want to understand the framework for that flexibility. So I think that's where we have a job as communicators and as leaders to help our organizations understand that framework. Because without that, we're sort of floating around, I think, too much.
Indeed, I love what you said, finding the divine in the ordinary, but you also said we live in a complex time with so much happening. I would describe it as living out loud in constant ambiguity and uncertainty. And Duncan, for the work that the Learning Economy Foundation does, how do you find divinity in the ordinary, given the complexity of the work that you do? And as you said earlier in your comments, you've been working in a remote environment for some time, but does that make it easier considering the complexity that Kathy just described?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I think, one of the ways that we can really, find this divinity in the work that we do is that in essence, learning economy is a circle in a Venn diagram that is, every single circle in this gigantic Venn diagram is a different piece of the education ecosystem. And we sit at a bunch of different tables with a bunch of different people. And so it's a big interconnected community. We play different roles in different communities, and we have different things to say depending on the hat that we're wearing. And so by being part of this large community, I'll hop on a Zoom call for one group, and I'll see 3 or 4 other people from 3 or 4 different Zoom calls that I'm part of in a different space. And so, you show up and these colleagues that you've had conversations with, them from different contexts, it makes it exciting to really engage in this collaborative work together. We all feel like we're, heading in the same direction, right, towards a more equitable education future. And so, yeah, just our kind of friends in the community help us really keep engaged and excited with the work, and they support us likewise. I think, in light of the kind of uncertainty and the shifting nature of remote work and how the world works, in early 2020, a Learning Economy Foundation held an event at Davos where we launched one of our big initiatives, the Internet of Education. Since then, Internet of Education has grown, but we haven't had really any in-person meetings, which we were absolutely planning to, right? To have continuous summits, to do Davos 2021, and other events surrounding some of the big global events related to, education and policy. And we've really had to shift that, and we've scaled back. And instead, what we've done is, open community calls. We've really leaned into the power that Zoom has to be able to, roll out of bed wherever you are in the world and attend a call. And it's really helped keep our excitement and our engagement going, and to kind of keep the thread of all the great work that we started when we could do in-person events, to keep that going in an engaging and exciting way.
Thank you. Eric, you talked about yourself as a dinosaur. I think that means you've got a deep legacy and perspective. And
It's one way of looking at it.
And you've watched the evolution of our economy, both public and private, and philanthropic and otherwise, over these last 2 years. I'm curious, you've talked about purpose, and one of the things that we've seen throughout this pandemic era is that you can still be very successful in driving with purpose, even if you're doing it in a hybrid or a remote way. So have we moved into a permanency in terms of that this is the way that we're going to move forward? And then if you're going to be able to lead and drive with purpose, you're going to have to do it in the ways that Kathy and Duncan have just described, which clearly have been very successful. What's your opinion?
Well, let's move back. First of all, there have been a number of studies, and I think APCO has done one of them actually, that show that companies that have a purpose, your employees are much more engaged, they're much more productive, and they really believe in that company. Number one. Number two, especially with the younger employee base, they're expecting that from their employer. And while that has transformed companies significantly from, say, when I started, it's really important. So that's the backdrop. Then you add in a hybrid model or remote work model, and it just takes on a life of its own. So companies that don't have that really are at a disadvantage for employee loyalty and employee productivity right off the bat. And I think what Kathy said, it hits it on the head. They're driving Team Lily stuff every day. They're doing that because without it, they're not going to get the productivity and the passion for what they do as much as a company that may have it. So that's the internal reasons why you have purpose. The external reasons why you have purpose, you're still dealing with trying to sell a product, trying to sell a service, and your consumer base or your buyer or your external stakeholder base is expecting that purpose to come through in their products. And there has been a tremendous transformation in our economy where people actually want their brands to stand for and their products to stand for far greater than the quality of the product that you're buying. So it's just that much more important today. The last thing I'll add to this is there are companies that really believe in purpose, and then there are companies that say, okay, we need to have a purpose because that's what's being asked of us both internally and externally. But if you don't bring it to life and you don't believe it, that's more detrimental than not having it at all, because you can see through it. And it's something that, quite frankly, has to be in the DNA of the company, both internally and externally.
Kathy Beiser, purpose cannot be driven without people. And as we turn now, I want to focus on something we're all grappling with, regardless of the industry in, that the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times and Harvard Business Review and virtually everywhere is described as the Great Resignation. How do you at Team Lily work to attract talent, keep talent, help that talent thrive in this Great Resignation era with so much that is confronting our employees, both personally and professionally, and that balance, as I said earlier, we're all living out loud. How do you drive with success in terms of keeping Team Lily intact, growing it, and driving with purpose?
A great question, Lacey, because I'll be honest, I think we're still on a journey. I think we're still learning and trying to figure that out. And I think anybody who says, oh, we've got it all figured out is very optimistic, because I think it's a tough one. So if we think about how we are trying to deal with, quote unquote, the Great Resignation, I think we're taking a look at all of the things that we sort of held true. and like certain jobs had to be here. Certain jobs had certain requirements, having people in central Indiana, well, maybe they all don't need to be in Indianapolis, or maybe they can be located in another place. So we're starting to re-examine those pieces, which I think will help us both attract as well as retain really great talent. I think we're also very focused on understanding and giving power to our leaders. I mean, even at the senior director role and all of that, because they understand their teams. They know what it's going to take to produce. And so it's less of a top down on that, but to say, okay, so what jobs and what roles need to be in certain places? So we're working through that. We have classified our jobs as fully remote. We're having those, and we have some that are absolutely have to be on site. I mean, you have to be in the factory to manage, medications and therapies and all of that. So there is that. But there is also this hybrid sort of in the middle. And what does that mean? And for us, it really gets to defining flexibility and really going deep into what flexibility means. It's not just, well, you're going to be here in the office these 3 days versus 2 days or 1 day or whatever, but it's having a flexible mindset and understanding that the people that you work with are adults. You're hiring the very best people and you want them to have autonomy and the ability to control their work and to get it done. If we say we need it done by X, then we got to trust them to get it done, right? And whether that is here, there, or how. And when it doesn't work, how do we coach and do better the next time? So I think that's been a big focus for us, for understanding that we really got a sense. I mean, so many people got a sense for, wow, what I was missing. When you were home, you all of a sudden realize, oh my gosh, there were things that I've missed. I missed certain closeness with my kids, my dog, my whatever, my health, all of that. So we're trying to figure out how do we ensure that people have time and the flexibility to take care of their whole person, not just their work and how they contribute to that. And at the same time, one of the things that we're grappling with, though, is just, I think I don't think, Eric, you're a dinosaur. I think you are really talking about something that we are all struggling with, is there is a certain magic, and they talk about it, what happens in the space between, right? When you're not, it's not the scheduled stuff, but it's that magic that happens when you truly collaborate, or you have those sparks of innovation, for the chance encounter, the drive-by conversation, and I heard this recently and I thought it was just really, a CEO talked about this, is that we didn't just hire you for the role, for that, because tasks you can do anywhere. When we hire great people, we hire you to learn, to mentor, to innovate, to help build the culture of this company, and to help, drive us forward. And that's not a task. It's a much broader role. So we're trying to figure out, how do we bring that together in this new hybrid environment? Because that's a tough one, right? So we do believe there is some magic that happens. I don't think my CEO would ever say magic, okay? This is me. But I think that that's just so important, because it's what's built our culture for 145 years. We've come together because when we unite, as part of our purpose, when we unite that caring with discovery, that's how we make lives better for people around the world. And we don't want it to be, I just do this task, because that is also the growth of people. And you discover that, oh my gosh, this person has this potential or this interest. How do I nurture that and help them progress and help them stay at Lilly? Because we really want our people, we want the best people to come here, and then we want them to stay and have a really robust career and do a lot of things. And so I think for our role as communicators is to helping articulate that in a way that feels real. It doesn't feel top down, but it does feel inclusive, and we take their feedback. And it's important we get their feedback when we're designing those messages, right? When we're creating that. This can't come out of my head. Can't come out of team members' head. It's got to come from the people who are experiencing this and what their needs are. So I think that's what we've been using, data, a lot of data, to figure out, what do we say? What's going to resonate? And sometimes that's sort of saying what the desire here is at the top, and helping make sure that we bridge, and educate and bring this to a better place, because we're going to have to lift some people up who are naturally kind of scared to go back to the office. As of November 16th, our people will have been vaccinated. So that's going to be that'll be a big breather, I think, for a lot of people. They'll feel safer in the office. They won't have to wear a mask in the office, but that is going to be a different thing. And so anyway, as I said, a journey for sure, but we've got to use data to help inform all of that so that we don't make any that we minimize, I guess, the number of missteps that we make, because we're never going to be misstep free. This is brave new world for all of us.
Eric, Kathy touched on a couple, 3 points that were so important. One, we hired not for you to fit in, but for you to add value. And two, finding the magic in the middle, in that space that so many have discovered when the world has just slowed down in the pandemic. How do companies in with your legacy and expertise and experience, how do you think companies can live in that space and find ways to continue to have employees lean in and add value rather than fit into the roles, which clearly we see with this Great Resignation. There aren't many who want to fit into roles. There are many who want to drive and grow, have roles grow around them. How do you find that magic in the middle that Kathy talks about?
I think as communicators, we just have to work that much harder, and you have to over communicate, because Kathy is absolutely correct. You have a wide swath of employees, some that are extroverted, some that are introverted, and it's our responsibility as leaders to bring the best out of them. And Kathy's 100% correct. You're not hired to do the tasks. You're hired to add value, and hopefully add value over a long period of time. And what is our role? Our role is to get the tasks done, set the strategy and the execution, get that done. But there's also team dynamics, there's team development, and most of all, giving your workforce opportunities to excel and go beyond their comfort zones. It's a heck of a lot easier to do that if they're an office away, but you have to get creative to drive what you do face to face, over a Zoom call or over a WebEx. I'm absolutely interested in Duncan's policy of turning the cameras off, because to me, that would be another barrier you have to go through to reach someone. There is nothing, in my estimation, that replaces face-to-face. And Zoom and the other video technologies are good. They're not great. But, I mean, Duncan and his team is excelling, going absolutely counterintuitive to anything that I would do. But if your employee base and it works, I say go for it. Continue down that path. But for me and what I've seen over my career, nothing replaces face-to-face. And if you can't do that because of, vaccines and people not going back to the workplace, you have to find a way to do that, whether it's an increase in one-on-one, an increase in your group, in the number of times you're talking. If it's things that you have to think outside of the box, then you're going to have to do it, because at the end of the day, we still have to do our jobs, we still have to get our results, and we still have to grow our people. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yes,
Eric, if I could build on that just for just a second, because I think that is just that you're spot on that in getting that done. Linda Rutherford at Southwest has talked about how they look at Southwest as every seat has a story.
Right.
And I think we actually should take that apply to employees and how we look at employee communications and things like that, because it is just not about a great big employee mass. Everybody's different. And I think that really came home during the pandemic. We really understood that people are more as individuals. There are some commonalities here and there, but I think as leaders, and especially leaders of communication functions, we really have to know the story behind every seat, that is on our team. And I think it's really, I stole it from Linda. But I think it's really an important thing that we think about, because then we can really design the kind of strategies that work, right? And that you can have the kind of dialogue with people, because people don't want to be part of a big thing. They want to be treated as individuals. This has brought home the importance of the individual, I think, more so than we've ever seen before. And I look at every member of my team thinking, not everybody thinks the same way I do. I've always thought that, but it's really even more different than I think I ever thought.
Duncan, I want to turn to you and lift up a point that Eric made about you can't replace in-person meetings, the eyeball to eyeball physical meeting. Do you agree with that? And how have you at the Learning Economy grappled with the question of the Great Resignation?
Yeah. So I think to that point, Learning Economy has been really fortunate in that we haven't really lost anyone since the pandemic started. And amidst the Great Resignation, I think that's for a number of reasons. First, we're very small. We don't have very many people, and so that mitigates a lot of the challenges that a lot of organizations that are much, much larger than us really grapple with every day in terms of communication and community. So we can really get to know the story of every employee. It makes it a lot easier to retain people, and really, once you build a rapport, it's a lot easier to turn off the camera and have that, meaningful communication, because you can kind of fill in the blanks and understand what's happening on the other side. But the other point is I think, it is possible to come close to the impact of face-to-face with digital tools, especially with camera off. But it requires digital tools. We have tools to really communicate effectively with each other face-to-face. And, that's our eyes and the muscles in our faces and our hands. These are what we use as humans every day. When we're doing online communication, especially without looking someone eye to eye, we need to use different tools. And there are absolutely challenges with that. I think it can be really difficult for a lot of people to get on board with that. Until I came to Learning Economy, I had, been in a classroom. I was used to, looking at kids and being able to look at their face and see how they were feeling about a certain problem. It was really a big shift for me, and it took a lot of time. But I think the other really key point is that, when you take these tools and you use them in a way that, intentionally builds community, you can create a lot of really powerful, meaningful relationships. You look at young kids today, ages 12 to 16, they use Discord, drop-in voice chat and audio to communicate with each other, to build friendships and relationships. I know of some colleagues and some friends' kids who have had, long-term, year-too-long romantic relationships with someone whose, face they've never seen in person. And that is proof to me that somewhere they're doing something right in terms of their relationship building using digital tools. I'm still learning. I think a lot of my colleagues are still learning, but it's possible. It's difficult. It's not easy, but it's possible. And I think if we're going to adapt to the remote future and meet workers where they're at, in order to retain them and to help them grow in their hometowns and with their families by their side, then I think we need to really look carefully at how we can use those tools.
Kathy, I'm curious, integrating new employees in a remote environment is incredibly challenging, especially during this era of the pandemic. How has Lilly used technology, used other resources to help onboard, bring in new employees and helping them to feel connected? Tell us a little more.
Yes. So I think I attended one of the very first virtual orientations to Lilly. So imagine this, we would bring people in, we'd have a day long, if not a little bit longer, sort of, session. You'd really get to understand culture and this and that. Well, it boiled down to maybe a couple hours, on a Teams call type of thing. So, and I still didn't know as much as I needed to know to get going. So we had to evolve our onboarding. And I think we actually have a team right now with our HR and recruiting colleagues who are actually turning the whole thing upside down. And we adapted, I think, which is great, to a virtual environment. But I think what they're doing right now is really smart. It is taking the whole approach and basically turning it upside down and saying, okay, what do we need in this that we haven't been doing before, that doesn't require sort of the in-person, but how do we make it feel personal? But there are a couple of things that that I know that will continue. Everybody is assigned like a peer coach. So somebody that is either on your team or at your level someplace else who you can connect with. This is somebody you don't report to, which is great. So your supervisor is going to tell you a lot about your role and what you're going to do and all of that. But I think, to me, just having somebody who could, okay, where do I go for the list of acronyms? Because we have more than anybody on the planet Not true, but it just feels that way at the time. And then how do you get to understand, who should I go to for this, or how should I figure that out? So I think the peer coach, that. We also have created just a big checklist for onboarding, for at least from my department, but I know it exists for other places, the people you need to meet. And then they get those things set up so that you meet the people that help you do your job better. So you have those meet and greets, and it's like sacred. Everybody makes time for those so that you get that, so you understand their role, you understand where they fit. So I think that's also a very important thing. We have frequent check-ins. So we have, especially at the beginning, we meet all the time with our supervisors, more so than we meet later. So I think some of those things help people get on board. And then I think it is sort of the informal meet and greets. We've had the spontaneous, I think, Duncan, you talked about it, and Eric as well, all of the kinds of, virtual fun things that you think you could do. But we're trying to find ways to discover new things about our colleagues. I've been through, took my team through a big transformation from a department standpoint during the pandemic, which was, that stressful process to begin with, and then add it being remote and all of that. I think it raised everybody's stress levels, and I apologize, team. But I think we brought in all these new folks, and now we've got to bring them together in gel. So we're spending a lot of time figuring out, just fun things. One of the things we've talked about, just to give you an example, was an article that I saw in Time magazine about, I'm eating right, I'm getting enough sleep, why am I so tired all the time? And it was basically because we don't have enough excitement in our lives, and we substitute the excitement, the new stuff, with scrolling. And guess what? The news is kind of stressful, so we replace our excitement with stress. That just raises our levels. So we've all made a commitment to less scrolling. We have to read the news, but how are we going to get to the news? And then the other thing is that we've started this do something new every weekend hashtag. It's really catchy. But we're sharing that with our teams, just on our team chat. Like, what did you do? The normal chatter that you'd have on a Monday morning, we're trying to make it that we can share broadly. And it actually feels a little bit more inclusive. I got some great ideas from a couple of folks on my team for this past weekend, and I've got some ones for the next weekend. So I think that type of thing, small but meaningful, help. And we talk very authentically too, so that, and we call things out. I think we try to say what people are thinking. Sometimes we just assume people are thinking, but and then don't say anything. So I think that's helped us as a team to be able to surface some of the things, especially for our new folks, to understand who the leaders are, who their peers are, just to create a much more inclusive environment. And we're trying to flatten. As an old company too, we've been, you tend to be like this, and we want to go like this, flatten it out. And humanity, got to have that in every aspect of what we do.
Eric, one of the things I recall in talking to other senior executives across our communications industry at the start of the pandemic was this belief that some had that you couldn't run a communications firm in a hybrid or in a remote setting. I think that clearly has been proven wrong. And I listened to the innovation, the creativity that you talked about, Duncan, that you, Kathy, and Team Lily are working on. And I'm curious, Eric, could we have accelerated this creativity and this technology, the use of technology, had we not moved into a remote environment, if you will, and shown that, yes, you can run a communications firm, or in many other industries, companies very successfully, notwithstanding the challenge of being remote. I'm curious, given your background and legacy, your thoughts.
Well, I think you have to qualify what success is. I don't disagree with your comments, but at the end of the day, we don't have a choice right now, right? You have a global pandemic that forced technology and other ways to think through and to work. I don't know long-term how effective a hybrid or a work from home environment is, especially from the agency side, because everything you buy into on what made agencies successful, the creativity, the teamwork, and all of that, it's it's yet to be determined if you can do that totally off-site. For the time being, I do buy into your comments, Lisa, of, yeah, we have the technology and it seems to be working and it's proving that it is working, but there hasn't been a huge alternative. I think that question will be answered maybe 18 months from now as people come back to the workplace. And that's without figuring out the ROI of, do I even need an office? What is the future of brick and mortar, right? Because even if you're only getting 85% of what you used to have, is that 85% better than the cost associated with square footage in a high rise? This is all yet to be determined. I think the acceleration of technology, and especially some of the examples that Duncan said, it's terrific, but you also have a wide breadth of people that are, some are technological wizards, some aren't, and there's a whole lot of learning there. I think on the other side, the relationship between a agency or an agency and their client, and does this replace travel and face-to-face meetings? I think it's much easier on that scale than it is internally to ensure that your team dynamic is as strong as if you were in front of people.
Thank you, Eric. I want to turn now, we have about 7 or 8 minutes left, and I want to talk about the importance of diversity, equity, inclusion in the work. We've talked so much around our conversation here, as I describe it, at the kitchen table this morning with Duncan and Kathy and Eric about inclusivity, about team connectivity and fitting in. I wrote an article a couple years back that I think is still relevant now about how embracing diversity will lift us out of this crisis faster. And Kathy, I want to start with you, because I wrote that from the perspective of a communications professional. And like then, but especially now, we hold a unique and very critical position working not only within companies, but for companies in influencing the way in which they communicate their value and their beliefs, and also how they describe that work internally in order to turn outwardly. I want to ask you and the rest of the panelists as we move forward here. There is an old South African saying that says, when you pray, you need to move your feet. We've seen so many organizations in these last 18 months move their feet. And of course, others haven't moved them quite quickly enough on diversity, equity, inclusion. How do you embed at Team Lilly the critical importance of DE&I in your culture, and what have you seen as the best practices for doing so? And importantly, what would you advise companies not to do with regard to DE? I want to start with you, Kathy, and then turn to you, Duncan and Eric, as we close out our conversation today. Kathy?
Sure. Incredibly important topic. And we don't make progress on it if we're not just very purposeful and mindful about it, because it is important. It makes it, we're just better when we do all of this. So I think at Lilly, we started with an awareness. We did a lot of work to dig into why we didn't have the diversity that we wanted. And this dates back a long time ago. And we created what we call the Journeys Project, where we really did in-depth looks at the experiences of women and Black employees, Latinx, and LGBTQ+. So we really did these in depth, and they're full of stories. And then we communicated those. So we had an understanding of what, the perceived barriers were to true inclusivity and true equity. So we did the awareness piece of it. We've done education. I think everybody should take, especially communicators, you should take your teams through unconscious bias training. It is one of the most valuable trainings that I've ever experienced. And I think because we have to uncover our unconscious biases because by definition, they're unconscious. You don't know them. So you've got to really work at that. We've got to have participation. You have to participate in ERGs. So we created the ERGs, and I think those are really important. We do a lot of engagement work too. Like to give you an example, in our function department, we do what we call diversity walks, where we're paired with somebody. gets us out of our home office, but lets us walk and you tell your story. You share stories with somebody else in your organization, doesn't just somebody different from you. And so we pair people up to make that sure that happens. And it creates actually some of that cultural fabric that we were talking about too. It's that stuff that you don't expect. But I think for all of this, I would also mention allyship, to have a formal allyship program. I think that's really important. People don't know what it means to really be an ally. So to do that, so you have all the good stuff. Where it goes bad, I think is where you keep it separate and it feels like a bolt-on to everything that you do. And as communicators, I think we have an even bigger responsibility to draw it through. So we have a manager on my team who is responsible for DE&I communications, but she sits under culture communications, which is a whole different look at, sort of how do we bring and knit all of this together, because it really should be part of our fabric, and creating the kind of standards too that make sure people understand. So what does DE&I look like from a communication standpoint? It's the nuts and bolts, imagery, people who are on the stage at a town hall or what, like you got to give people the framework and not hope it just happens. You have to have some standards and you have to be really clear about those standards and what we expect from people. But I think if you don't have that, then that's also a mistake. Again, if you're not purposeful about it and just hope it happens, as we all know, hope is not a strategy. So we've got to make sure that we plan for it and then we measure it. Everything that we do, we measure. And if we're not doing well on it, we get a plan to do better, right? Because it is a journey. And when we have a setback, we examine what happened, and then again, how do we do better going forward? So I think that's just the only way to do it. But if you keep it separate, and you keep it a bolt-on, I think it seems like an HR thing. It also seems like a separate thing, as opposed to being, you lose the inclusive part of it. And that's really, really important because that's how we get to equity.
Thank you. You've talked about framework, you talked about allyship, the importance of ERGs, the importance of measurement and data. And I think, put in another way, what you've just said in terms of the view of DEI, I think once upon a time as being an HR function, I tell folks the way you measure the importance of DEI within a company is how close does the individual overseeing DEI sit next to the CEO. Duncan, I'm curious, what is the ways in which you've seen DEI embedded within the learning economy, and how do you help your employees to better turn inward so they can better turn outward for the communities and others that you work with?
Sure. There are kind of two facets to this question. Learning Economy Foundation's mission is to really solve crack the nut of global education for everyone, right? To provide quality education to anyone in the world. And to do that through technology, through policy, through community. We need to have really strong understanding of the diverse scope of what it means to be human in order to successfully do this. I mean, if we're going to crack the nut for everyone in the world, then we need to understand the needs and the challenges of all sorts of different types of people. We see this coming to bear in conversations, with folks across the world. And I think, one of the things we do is we try and leave uncomfortable silences in calls, especially with folks when you're talking to someone that's, English is not their first language, or maybe not even a language they're particularly proficient with, and yet English is the global standard. What we have to do is we have to leave space for people who might need a little extra time to, think about their answer, or to muster up the courage to answer these questions. And in doing so, you hear voices that you otherwise might not have. And so with dealing with other people, leaving this space and creating these open spaces so that, kind of underrepresented and quieter voices can filter to the top in a way that otherwise would not happen. In terms of internally, the challenges that DEI efforts are trying to address are fundamentally challenges with, the hearts and minds of people who have power and influence, right? This is a problem with our whole society. We have embedded, racism, and we have embedded discrimination in a lot of the aspects of our society. And so in order to change that, you need to, change the people and change the hearts and minds of the people who make the decisions. And so from the top down, being very clear about actively addressing challenges in a way that is frank, it's honest, it doesn't make excuses, goes a long way into showing the rest of the team, A, good example, but B, you know, leading from the top down in terms of the decisions that you make to make differences for folks from, you know, underrepresented groups. In terms of what not to do, you know, I have been on several calls where, you know, DEI efforts have been little more than, hey, look, we've got a person from X community, how great, right? This is not okay. It puts folks on the spot, and it's a form of tokenism that just doesn't work. Instead, you know, if you really want to elevate people on your team, get to know them and what they do well and their goals, and then when an opportunity arises, you know, put them in the race, right? Give them the opportunity to use their talents and their goals in a way that you know, can advance the goals of your company. But I think putting people on the spot simply because they belong to a certain community can often cause a lot of problems and stress for that person. So.
Thank you, Duncan. You know, your comments in terms of hearing voices and bringing people to the table and making them feel included, not in a tokenism kind of way, but in a meaningful way. So powerful, and makes me think of the program here at APCO called Accelerating What's Right, which is exactly what we are trying to do around our table here in Accelerating What's Right with regard to DE&I, and something that we've very proudly have been recognized for. Eric, I'm curious, how do you accelerate what's right around DEI in organizations today? What do you see?
I mean, I think it's either in your DNA or it isn't. I think Duncan's comments of identifying someone and saying, isn't it great that we have this person from this group is just horrific. And I think companies that do it well, this is, I think, so far before the equality reckoning of 2020, this is things that some companies do it really well. I remember when I started, my first corporate job was at Miller Brewing Company owned by Philip Morris. My first week I was in awareness training before you even showed up at the office. And it was the most eye-opening because I saw the world totally differently. And I think the more training that you can have before you start and then ongoing is great. I mean, companies that do this well, affinity groups have been around for a very long time. Now they're departments, right? It has to be a part of a company. It has to be a part of its DNA, and it shouldn't be treated. It should be a way of life. And the companies that do it well recognize that, and the companies that don't isolate it and draw attention to it, which is, quite frankly, tokenism.
Eric Krause, Kathy Beiser, Duncan Cox, thank you all for a very powerful conversation today about the future work in building a strong and inclusive culture. I want to thank Provoke for inviting us to have this conversation. I want to thank everyone who's joined us today as well for it. And thank you very much. We wish you well.
Lucy, thank you.
Thank you all.